Welcome to CISSP Training.
Okay, so up to now we've laid out the legal requirements for the organization, the regulatory requirements, we have the acceptable risk level, we've identified our assets,
Video by
we've calculated our
Xelmart.com.
risk. We've got all this information and we took it to management. Management decided what to do with the risk. And then what's the next step? What do we do now? Well, now we have to build an actual security program, and there's a few different categories that we're going to talk about in building a whole security program. Some people don't know what the term security program really means. Another term for it could be enterprise security architecture.
Video by Xelmart.com.
So one of the most important things about your security program is that it's a layered approach. And that means you have several different barriers that somebody has to go through to be able to get to the asset. And it depends upon the sensitivity of that asset, how many barriers there are. So it's a very sensitive data, let's say. You've got physical barrier, you've got firewall, maybe another firewall, you've got access control, encryption. All of these different layers somebody would actually have to break through to be able to get to your asset. Now, this is a very common concept in security, and one thing that organizations don't do is that they don't do the layered approach around the whole environment, because they'll do the firewall, through the DMZ. You have a couple firewalls and your access control and such, but they don't realize that remote access, whoever's coming through remote access, they don't have enough layers there. Or the wireless network, they don't have enough layers there. So it's not just having enough barriers or enough layers of protection, it's having them in the right place where you're most vulnerable. Now, we certainly don't want any surprises when we're developing our security program, which actually happens a lot. The surprises are when you don't collect enough data. Once you start developing your security program, a lot of things come up. If you don't do your research and find out how the business works, find out where the sensitive data is, find out where the sensitive data travels, the in and out points of your environment. If you don't find all of this stuff out and just start building your security program, you're going to run into things and you're going to start going one way and looking at point solutions. So really the most important thing is that assessment, going through, identifying the risks, and then start building. So you can look at the security program as the foundation for your whole enterprise security architecture. And just like any foundation, it's going to support a lot of different things. And I said earlier that I've seen companies where they do the best they can, but it's hard to build a security program when you don't understand it holistically, because it's not just technical, it's the processes that have to be understood, it's the business issues. So you need to take the time to build it properly, and then if you build it properly, then you don't have to go back and try to fix things. You could build on top of it, and you've got security through the different layers. Now, when companies want to build a security program or they need to secure their environment, a lot of them don't know how to start. And that's where you get into this whole analysis paralysis. You're going into meetings, you're collecting data, and you don't do anything with that data. And that's when you go to point solutions. This whole process is it's easily mapped out, and you should follow it kind of A to Z. And so you understand who the shareholders are of the security program and who's ultimately responsible. You come up with your strategies and your principles of what is our acceptable risk level, what is it we have to protect, and then you develop your security architecture. Now, a lot of people think a security architecture is the technical architecture, but it's not. It's your security architecture is the actual framework that you're going to use, and I talked about like 7799 is a framework, and
Xelmart.com.
there's some others out there that are very useful, but you have to figure out which framework are we going to use. Then you come up with your organizational structure, which means who's going to be responsible for what. You have to assign roles and responsibilities. Then you could develop your technical framework, because technology is supposed to enforce what your strategy is, and technology is just one piece that enforces that. Then you come up with your baselines and your standards. You come up with your compliancy, make sure that you're compliant with the policy, the different laws.
Video by
You
Xelmart.com.
come up with assurance. Now what assurance means is that you know that the security things are working as they're supposed to be working. How are you going to check on that? That's monitoring and auditing. And more companies are developing security metrics. Security metrics are very important because they could track how well your security components are doing, how well your security initiatives are. You know, in the past, a lot of security professionals have had a hard time, or somebody in the organization going to management and say, you know, I need some more money for this. I need, you know, we need to roll out IPS or IDS or whatever. And management would say, well, I just gave you $200,000 last year. Why should I give you some more money?
Video by
And
Xelmart.com.
it's really hard to sell security because it's basically like insurance. If everything goes good, nothing happens. So it's been a hard sell to management when you need funds or you need to build things that they don't fully understand. And that's one benefit of setting up metrics. You can show that when you put a control in,
Video by Xelmart.com.
you could actually have metrics to indicate the amount of successful or unsuccessful attacks, the amount of successful or unsuccessful viruses that got in. Another metric is the amount
Video
of
by
time,
Xelmart.com.
operational time it took for to clean up or to recover, amount of downtime, amount of revenue. So metrics are becoming more and more important and mature in the environment. Now there is a difference between functional and assurance requirements. Functional is, does it do what it's supposed to do? That's one thing. Does it have the functionality to do the access control or do
Video
content
by
filtering?
Xelmart.com.
That's one thing. Assurance is, how do we know it's doing it that well? So assurance is the level of confidence that we have in something. Assurance is, you can only have assurance if, like, you test how something's built or you run it through tests. And that's why if you buy a product, you should get the vendor to get you a copy of the product, you take it into your lab and you test it yourself. So the difference between the requirements are functionality requirements, what do we need this thing to do, and assurance requirements, how are we going to make sure it's doing what it's supposed to be doing in a
Video by
secure manner.
Xelmart.com.
So there's different ways to conceptualize what a security program looks like. And that's actually sometimes confusing to people because they'll look in different resources and have different boxes and different bubbles and different things in different places. And that's because it is conceptual to build a whole security program. But just like we talked, the first steps are understanding the business drivers, understanding the regulatory and legal requirements.
Video by Xelmart.com.
There's a threat profile, and you come up with an actual strategy. And then you put it into the framework that you've decided upon, the 7799, or there's a SOPSA model that's becoming more common, and you map it to what do we need within our environment. These we call
Video
the
by
blueprints.
Xelmart.com.
You have identity management blueprint, access control blueprint, and basically what you're doing is you're getting a strategy, you're putting it into a framework, and then you're getting more granular. What exactly do we need out of identity management?
Video
What
by
exactly do we need out
Xelmart.com.
of privacy? And then you put it up into processes. You integrate it into business processes themselves, and then you have metrics to be able to determine the level of success or the performance of these controls you've put in place. Now, in the CISSP exam, they are diving more into what goes into developing a security program and risk management and all that. And that's because it's more important in the industry. We're moved up from technical, it's going up into the business area. So of course the exam is going to keep up with the industry.
Video by Xelmart.com.
It's very interesting if you look at the history or the trends or the evolutionary steps of this industry. The infrastructure or the component management is basically where we're the most mature. We have, in the security world, we have a lot of techies. Our technology itself has come a long way, and our technology really provides all the protection or the security we need. It's just, do we have it in the right place? Do we configure it? And there's more than technology that can put a company at risk. So really the component and the operational, most companies are doing well. Now, where most companies are now evolving to is doing analysis and understanding what's actually going on in operations. And this is where the actual development of metrics come in. Once you develop metrics, then you can start collecting data, do a historical analysis, and make much more informed decisions. And once you get past that point and really understand what's happening in your department, your company, that's when you actually can integrate security within a business process most effectively. The reason that this is hard to do is because there's so many things that's involved with security.
Video by Xelmart.com.
Just like we have 10 domains that we're going to cover, but just one domain. Just like the first domain, we're looking at all the things within risk management. We're going to look at policies. We're looking at how to develop a security program. In telecommunications, we'll be looking at all parts of the network, routers and firewalls and protocols.
Xelmart.com.
So it's difficult to be able to understand all of this and come up with plans to secure it. But the first problem that most people don't do is to come up with a plan. They just start. So it's important to come up with your application integrity plan, your identity management plan, your privacy plan. You know, what are you going to put in place? What are the actual processes and who's going to do it? Now, one interesting thing is that within organizations, security wasn't IT for a long time, and then as more people realized how important security was, then there's a role like a CISO or a CSO, which is great, and they'll have a security team. Just that those exist is a huge win for the security industry overall, that those CISO and CSO roles actually exist and that they're at the C-level. But one thing is that we have a security team and it's siloed. How can one security team integrate security across a whole organization? They can't, because it's not just technical. Now, if all you needed was people to run the firewalls and people to look at the IDS alerts or somebody to do event management, that's one thing. But since this is a business and there's all these different types of risks that can happen in the different departments, one security team cannot understand all the business risks that can take place and the security risks and be able to control it. So security needs to be across the organization. And like I said before, there needs to be delegation, and that has to come from the senior level of, it's not just the CISO's responsibility. It needs to go out to the different business managers or the department heads, and they need to know what we're talking about to a certain degree of how to identify risks, who to talk to about those risks. So on one hand, it's great that we've actually moved security from IT. We've come up with these different roles, and a lot of companies actually have security teams. But now we have to go a step further. We have to identify who's going to be responsible for security throughout the organization.
Video by Xelmart.com.
And different organizations have the different names for business unit, process owner, but it has to go across the organization itself. Otherwise, you really can't have holistic security. Now, one of the mantras that's been in the industry is that security is a process, not a product. And that's true. Security is supposed to be a process, not a product. What that means is you can't buy a product, install it, and now you're secure. You have to actually understand the business processes and the workflow and identify with the steps within the processes where the threats can come in.
Xelmart.com.
And many people have gone through this because regulations require it, but not to the necessary. A lot of them go through this just to please the auditors. But you actually have to understand not only how the business works, but the different steps through like a flow chart or something, and identify where the risks happen. So that's how you integrate security within a business process. And most companies, I don't think anybody's fully there yet, but that's our utopia. That's what we're working towards. Now, in the past, security usually came from IT, as I said, and that's a bottom-up approach. And the problem with a bottom-up approach is you have people in IT who they actually don't know all the risks to the company. They understand the technical risks, but they don't understand all of the risks, and they don't understand the full business. They don't have the purse strings. They don't have the recognition. Security needs to come from the top down, because it's senior management that can enforce security standards, can enforce that people will be doing what they're supposed to be doing. They have the money, and they have a larger view of the organization. Instead of just one component like IT, they can understand an organization and all the different types of risk and how it can affect the company. So security needs to come from the top down, because the top is the one that's liable in the end. So I've fought with management over a lot of years, and I'm just thankful that security is now becoming into more people's consciousness, and they have to think about this at different levels. But people who've been in this industry for quite some time know what a struggle it's been to get management to key in and understand these things. Now, I said that there's different models or frameworks that you can use to build a security program, and the most popular one it's called BS 7799. That's British standard, but now it's been accepted by the industry body, so it's ISO 7799. And if you look at the different things that fall under these guidelines, they map pretty well to the CISSP domains, because within the CISSP domains, we actually go over what needs to take place in every security program. So if most people or organizations aren't going to know how to build a security program, so that's why they laid this out. Like I said, it was British Standard 7799, and it was a de facto standard. De facto just means that it's a good idea, so everybody starts doing it. And then it can move into an actual standard, which this has done. And that's what the ISO, that's International Standards Organization.
Video by Xelmart.com.
So this, companies actually get certified against this, and the 7799 is going through some upgrades or being a little bit modified by the ISO group. Now, as if things weren't confusing enough, what you'll usually see
Video by
when we're looking at this type of thing is ISO I7799, because the British Standard 7799 was actually broken into 3 parts, and the CISSP exam covers really just the first 2 parts. In the British Standard 7799, the first part talks about the controls that could be used, the countermeasures that should be used. And the second part talks about how to actually build a security program. using the controls that are in Part 1. So since we're kind of going through this flux, the numbers are actually changing, which are confusing some people. So what you'll commonly see today is ISO 17799-2005. And that means it's a standard, an ISO standard. They're still using the 7799, and 2005 is when it was created. That's for the first part. For the second part, they've already moved away from 7799, and you'll see ISO 27001, and that represents the second part. It gets too confusing. So 7799, it basically had 3 parts. And as ISO is kind of bringing under its wings, it's moving it to its own numbering scheme. And so that's why people are kind of confused with it. So if you see ISO I7799, that deals with the first part. That's the actual controls. If you see ISO 27001, that's the second part. That's how to actually build a security program. Because security is so important, the organization, the ISO organization, is coming up with its whole series. It's very common to like the 9000 series with quality, if you've ever had to go through being compliant with the 9000 series. Whole series, a whole bunch of numbers that indicate exactly what needs to take place. So the ISO has come up with a series starting off with 27000 that has a vocabulary of all the terms that it's going to be used in that series. So again, right now what you'll usually see is ISO I7799, which represents the controls that could be used, and then ISO 27001, which represents the security program. Now, it's the security program standard that companies can choose to get certified against. So you can have an outside auditor who's already been blessed, by ISO that they could do this. They'll come in and see if you're actually following the standard and are compliant with it, and then you can brag to your customers to say that somebody else says we're secure. I mean, that's the reason that you actually do it, is provide confidence with your customers and your partners. Now, something else that's getting a lot more limelight is called COBIT. And this is the Control Objectives for Information and Related Technology, COBIT. And this is a whole structure for really how to set up a IT infrastructure. It's not necessarily just about security, although it has a portion that deals with security. It's about all the things that should take place in a IT infrastructure. In COBIT, there's 4 domains. It's broken down into planning and organization, acquisition and implementation, delivery and support, and monitoring. So it has all of these different domains. And within security, we're usually just looking at the delivery and support domain that ties into the security issues. Now, COBIT is great, but you can't really implement all of it within even 3 years because it's huge. It covers everything. But as security professionals, there are specific things that are called out that we'll look at. So the common things that we'll look at as security professionals are we have to come up with a security plan. There's a piece about identity management, user group management, security testing. So COBIT will lay out what the requirements are for security infrastructure, and it'll look at, it's trying to, or the goal is to tie IT resources to business processes. That's the whole goal of COBIT, is to make sure that IT is in alignment with business. So COBIT actually has a lot of different parts to it. First, it'll have an overall, what actually this one section's about, a security plan. What is a security plan? And then you actually dig down and get into the control objectives, and there's performance indicators, and there's maturity models. So it starts at a high layer and it keeps kind of going down into how to do this whole thing. So it has performance indicators. Really, they set the goal. What is it that you want to accomplish with developing your security plan? Well, and then you have KPI, their performance indicators to measure how well you're doing that. Your identity management, they'll have goals set out and metrics on how you're doing. Same thing with user management. So they provide these metrics that can be used. So COBIT is a very high-level approach to security. It provides control objectives. That's what they're called, control objectives. And basically, you have to provide a control that maps to that objective. And that's what the auditors are going to be looking at. They'll have the control objectives, and then they'll look at the control or make sure you have a control in place. So it's a high-level approach. COBIT is, I think it's useful because it covers so many things. Because a lot of companies don't know that they have to have a security plan, they have to have these type of policies, they need to do this, that other thing. So it has a whole list of things that need to be done. They do have performance indicators that are a little bit high level. A lot of companies get more detailed into the metrics they use. Now, something else that's becoming more important within the industry is information technology infrastructure library. And this is not something that's directed at security, even though there's a security component in it. The goal of ITIL is to run the IT department in a very efficient way to perform its services to its customers. And its customers are the internal groups within the company. So ITIL is really about the IT department and making sure that it gets requests and fulfills them properly, and they're very efficient and effective. And there is a component of security in it, but it's something that you should be aware of because it's becoming more and more important because we have to save money. There's a lot of wasted money and wasted time within IT departments, and we have to make sure that they map properly to business processes. Now, security governance is another term that is in the industry, and I feel sorry for a lot of people that they get very confused. In fact, Information Security Magazine asked me to write an article about what is 7799, what is Octave, what is HIPAA, what are all these acronyms that are being thrown around, because companies these days, the business people, not only do they not necessarily understand technology or the security, but they already have their job. They already have a job, and now security is becoming part of their job, and it can be very complex, and they don't necessarily have the time to do all the research and live and breathe security like the professionals. So, another thing is, what is the security governance? This is another term that is very subjective to a lot of people. They don't know how to necessarily articulate it. So security governance is it's like corporate governance. Corporate governance means that the board and senior management is overseeing and responsible that the organization is running properly, that nobody's cooking the books and all that. So security governance is that security is being controlled, and it's being done properly. It's not just in IT. It's a board issue. It's a senior management issue. It's spread out across the different process owners or the business units. So security governance is something that's kind of wishy-washy, where some people don't know what it is, but it's out in the industry being discussed a lot. And I put together an actual article describing security governance, and what I did is, instead of use the common terminology that's used to explain what this is, I give an example. So when you're looking at security governance, you can look at two different companies, and they both have firewalls, they both have access control, they both have a security team, they both have a CISO in place. So it seems like they're both the same. They're doing the same amount of work in security, they're performing the same. But that really is not true. When you look closer, you can have company A that actually has a security governance program. And that means that everybody who is supposed to be involved is involved. The board, senior management, the different process owners. The other company, it's just an IT. They don't have the security spread out, and senior management isn't taking it seriously. Another thing is that the executive, in the company A, the executives are setting the stage, they're setting the tone for security. Company B, you have a CISO who has all the responsibility and liability, but no support, no funds. And for a long time, and even today, CISOs are commonly the sacrificial lamb because the senior management isn't taking responsibility. And company A that has security governance, they would understand the business processes. They understand where the security risks are within the business processes. In company B, they haven't documented or looked at the processes. That's a big difference. In company A that has security governance, they hold their people accountable. They hold not only the CISO, but the process owners and even the employees. In this other company, they have policies, but they don't ever back them up. So you could see the difference between two different companies. One has security governance and one doesn't. And another thing with security governance is you have the metrics in place and you're continually trying to improve and you're monitoring. So security governance is really becoming a big thing in the industry because regulations are requiring it. And a lot of people don't understand what actually it is. It means doing the right thing, doing all the things that we're talking about, especially in this domain, and being responsible, carrying out due diligence and due care. Now, we've talked about risk management. We've looked at some frameworks that could be used to set up a security program. We talked about what a security program is. Now we have to kind of start filling it in. And in the components, especially in security management practices, would be the development of the policies, the standards, the baseline, the guidelines, roles and responsibilities. So some people aren't actually familiar with the policies. Some people are at a very technical level and they never see the policies and they don't realize how many there really are. Some people think there's just one policy that affects and addresses everything. Most organizations have several different policies that address, specific issues of how you're going to deal with sensitive data or physical security. So there's a lot of different policies usually involved. Now, the overreaching policy is the organizational policy, and that addresses the business needs, the laws, regulations. But this is the directives for management. Basically, the policy is what management says the role of security in this company. What is the role of security in this company? So there's different types of policies, but there is usually one overreaching policy itself. So in this organizational policy, what's there? Well, we have the strategic direction of what security management is all about. We identify the compliancy issues. We define the actual security program itself. You define the roles, not individuals. You don't call out individuals. You define the roles and their responsibilities. You define the actual security team. So in a way, it's a high-level roadmap, but it is very high level. A policy is not specific because it has to cover so many different departments and so many different processes and different technologies. If your policy was specific, let's say about a type of firewall, you'd have to change it once you did a refresh. So a policy is almost like a law. It has to be interpreted. So the organizational or the overall policy works as the framework for the security program. And what that means is it's the directives for management. They've laid out in the policy, it lays out all the things we went over. And this is what you go to when there's a question. After a security program is put in place, if there's ever a question of how to deal with something, or if there's somebody doesn't agree with some of the procedures or standards, you always go back to the policy to see what it says, because the whole thing is you have to be compliant with the policy. That's the whole goal of all the security stuff within an organization. And it has to be a good policy that covers all the responsibilities of security. Now, like I said, there's several different types of policies. There's individual policies that are called issue-specific policies, also called functional policies. And they are going to address specific things that the overall policy can't get into. For example, email is only supposed to be used for business use. You can't use it for personal use. There's no confidential information that can be passed through email, or internet use can only be for business use. What to do in physical emergencies. So there's individual policies that deal with individual specific items. So within every policy, you'll have a purpose of what the policy is, you'll have the scope, what this policy actually covers, and then you'll lay out the requirements. And there's a lot of great templates and policies out there that can be used instead of starting from scratch. So we have organizational policy, we have issue-specific policy, and we also have system-specific policy. Now, people usually aren't as familiar with system-specific policies. They indicate what a system or a group of systems are supposed to be used for. So, for example, you could have a policy that says only top secret information can be held on these servers, or this system or maybe a server farm can only be used for e-commerce processes. So system-specific policies is what what their title is. It's specific to the system itself. And again, it's not usually this one server. It's a lot of times it's a set of technology or a set of servers. So it defines what the security objectives are and the requirements for these specific systems. So again, just like any other policy, it'll have a purpose, the layout of scope, which is what are this system-specific policy, what systems is it dealing with, and then it'll lay out the actual policy requirements. Now, policies are very high level. If you've ever read them, they're hard to kind of sink your teeth in. It's like, what do I need to do really? Because a policy is abstract. It's at an abstraction level, and it doesn't really tell you, what configurations need to be put in place, what type of technology, what type of skill set do we need. It sets the tone, and then you have to have specific things underneath the policy to get more detail-oriented. You're going to have standards that are going to be more detail-oriented. The standards are pulled from or come from the policy, but they also support the policy. We'll also be covering baselines and guidelines. All of these things come from the policy and support the policy. The goal is that a policy is so high level. I mean, what if somebody told you, you be good? Well, what does good mean? What does bad mean? What are the ramifications for being bad? So that's why we need much more specific things. So a standard is something that has to be enforced. It has to be followed. And there's a lot of different standards. Like employees have to have a badge with their ID, their photo ID always available. Guests can't walk around without being with an employee with them. And then there's standards that deal specifically with technology on what the configurations absolutely have to be. So standards have to be followed. If
Video
they're
by
followed,
Xelmart.com.
then that means that the policy is being enforced. So within the policy, so within the standard, you'll have laid out exactly who does what or what needs to happen. And something that's very common is a configuration standard, and that goes through the exact configurations
Video by Xelmart.com.
and the settings, and they're usually pretty large documents that are very detail-oriented. Now, a baseline is, for test purposes, you need to know that a baseline is the minimum
Video
level
by
of security
Xelmart.com.
required. And what that means is that we have an acceptable risk level set, and let's say within the accounting department, we can only use systems that have a C2 rating. Now, if you're familiar with Orange Book, you know what that means, a C2 rating. We can only process top secret information on mandatory access control systems. So baseline means we have to have at least this much security. Now we can go above this, we could have more security on top of it, but we have to at least have this much. So really, if we follow all the standards, that means that we're hitting that baseline. So if we follow all the standards properly, we are providing the minimum level of security that's required. And then, as I said today, we're getting into metrics to be able to define these and keep track of the security levels a little bit better. Now, there's a lot of products out there that will provide you different metrics, and those are important to understand how well you're doing in reducing the vulnerabilities, reducing your risk overall. And this is outside of CISSP.
Video by Xelmart.com.
But what's important is that within your company, you develop standards and metrics that makes sense to your environment. Because a lot of my customers are very concerned about what metrics. They don't know what metrics to come up with, and they say, well, what's used in the industry, or what are companies using? And it really doesn't matter what metrics you're using as long as you stay with them, as long as they're standard across the board, because they have to represent something within your organization, and that's what you're going to report up to management to indicate how well things are going on. But metrics are used to indicate how well we're doing against our baselines. So we set our baselines, the metrics, we keep track of those to say, yep, we're hitting our baseline, or no, we're not hitting our baseline. We need to put another control in place. And then there's guidelines, which are just suggestions on how to deal with different issues. They're not something that has to be followed. They're guidelines or suggestions. Now, there's guidelines in the industry, and some companies develop their own guidelines internally, because you can't have a standard for everything. So maybe a guideline explains what a private key and a public key, how they work, and how they work within a PKI. That could be an example. And then you have procedures, which are step-by-step instructions of how to do something. And this is really where most companies fall down, is to have complete sets of procedures. Because there are a lot of writing, there's a lot of stuff to put down. But the reason that you should have procedures is to ensure that things are happening in a standardized way. Would you want somebody to set up a server any way that they want to? Or should they set up a server and have the same configurations as the other servers? So it's all about standardization. So if we look at how these components come together, let's say we have a policy that unauthorized users should not have access to sensitive data. And a policy would be that high level. Then you'd have a standard that says users must have a smart card and a PIN number to be authenticated to, and then authorized to access this sensitive information. That's the standard. The baseline is the number of unauthorized accesses allowed, because really you can't have 100% security,
Xelmart.com.
like I've talked about. So you have to set a baseline that's a clipping level. It's an actual threshold. Then you have a guideline that explains what identification and authorization is, and potentially how to use smart cards. And then you have procedures on how to actually configure like a database that controls where the sensitive data is. So this is how they all work together. And again, the policy is the management directives, it's high level, and all of these other things are developed to provide meat for us to actually know what to do to be compliant with the policy. So the policy should not just be known by the security group, and that happens. If you go into an organization, you say, let me see your security policies, some people will never know where they are. Everybody should at least know how to get access to them. They should be on like an intranet site or something. But the CEO and the board actually needs to bless them. They need to bless the policies that are put in place. And so we just see how what the relationship is. That standards, procedures, baselines, and guidelines come from the security policy and support it. That's the relationship. Now, what's senior management's role in security? We actually talked about this a little bit because I said that security should be top down, not bottom up. Security management needs to run.
By Xelmart.com.
They don't do day in, day out operational stuff, but they have to make sure that people are staying on security. They have to make sure it's continually funded as needed, that it doesn't just stall, because a lot of security initiatives start and then aren't completed. It's actually management's responsibility to enforce this, whatever the new security initiative is. And the whole thing about security, the biggest, hardest thing to do is change culture. Implementing technology is the easiest thing to do, but people are really usually the problem. And senior management has to be behind security to help that culture change so that you can have some type of enforcement on the rules that are being followed. So we need to understand the security roles that should be outlined in the security program. Now, data owner, a lot of people in the corporate world aren't as familiar with a data owner. In the government, in the military, they're very familiar because they follow very structured security. So a data owner is somebody who's responsible for a set of data. So let's say that there's a VP that is over accounting. That VP would be the data owner for all of the accounting information. Means that they're responsible for ensuring that data is protected. Now, they're not responsible for configuring the access controls or doing the operational issues. What they have to do is set a classification. The classification of the data indicates the level of protection that's required. So a data owner is responsible for classifying data, and that in turn protects, they're setting the protection level of the information. It's the custodian that's actually going to do the day in, day out configuration, installation of software and devices. So the data owner sets the classification. The custodian, which is usually the IT department, will do the actual setup, the configurations, the software and everything to make sure it meets that classification level. Because the lower the classification level, the less amount of controls you need. The higher the classification, the more controls have to be in place. And then there's the auditor. Not everybody loves the auditors because they're going to come around and find out what you're not doing right. But really, security people should look at auditors in a different light. They can help you with your business, what you're trying to tell the business people. A lot of people think auditors are just going to come around and say, you're not doing this right, you're not doing that right, and then maybe you're going to get in trouble. But if you're actually practicing security the way that you are supposed to, a lot of times you'll have gaps that you want to get fixed. but you don't have the funds, or you don't have the acknowledgement,
Video
or
by Xelmart.com.
nobody's looking at it or paying attention to it. So once auditors come around, they can mark you off on that, and then you can go to management and say, okay, not only do I say that we need to do this, the auditors say that we need to do this. And auditing is becoming a bigger thing because of all the regulations. Most large organizations have internal auditors that are ensuring the compliancy to the policy, and then there's external auditors that will come and make sure the company is compliant with the regulations.